On a nationally televised showdown with over 12 million viewers, Jasmine Crockett confronts Sean Hannity over one of America's most painful divides: public safety versus systemic injustice. As Hannity demands more prisons and police funding, Jasmine peels back the curtain, revealing a system where being poor means being punished and where freedom has a price tag of just $500. The clash intensifies when she unveils hard numbers, corporate ties, and the human cost of a justice system built on profit, not fairness. Her voice trembles, but not with fear, with fury and truth. What if the greatest threat to your freedom wasn't crime, but the system built to punish the poor? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The camera soared over the skyline of New York City, cutting through the amber haze of early evening before plunging into the electric blaze of the studio lights. Inside the Fox News set, the air was ice-thin, charged with tension, like the moments before a thunderclap. Sean Hannity leaned forward behind his polished desk, blue tie stiff and perfectly knotted, fingers steepled with theatrical control. Millions were watching. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his voice sliding with smug authority, "if police and prisons aren't given more funding, then tell me, who's going to protect American families from the criminals crawling our streets?" The words were razor-edged, engineered for maximum damage. Gasps rippled through the live studio audience, already stirred by the on-screen graphics flashing. "Crime wave. Are we handcuffing our heroes?" He smirked slightly, sure he'd drawn blood before the battle had even begun. Then, silence. The camera pivoted like a hawk closing in on its prey. It found her. Jasmine Crockett sat composed, dressed in a deep navy suit that absorbed the glare like armor. Her hand rested not on her heart, nor clenched in a fist, but firmly over a thick manila folder marked in bold black. "Undue detention, systemic injustice case files." Her eyes didn't flinch. They locked on Hannity with the cold fury of someone who had spent too many nights reading autopsy reports of teenagers who never made it home. For a heartbeat, she didn't speak. Her silence screamed louder than any slogan. A single beat of light ran down the edge of her cheekbone. Part sweat, part defiance. Then she slowly lifted the folder, placing it on the desk in front of her, like a war drum being set before battle. And though she hadn't yet said a word, every person watching could feel it. This wasn't going to be a debate. This was going to be a reckoning. And just as the silence threatened to tip into Jasmine's control, Sean Hannity leaned into the desk like a man reloading a weapon. Not to ask, but to dominate. His voice dropped to a low, authoritative rhythm, the kind that millions of loyal viewers had come to trust not because it was accurate, but because it sounded certain. "Let's stop pretending," he said, eyes narrowing as if bracing to deliver a national verdict. "America isn't just facing challenges. We're being attacked from within. Our cities have become war zones." He turned slightly, inviting the camera to capture his solemn expression, as if delivering a presidential address. Then the screens behind him flashed with bold, blood-red headlines. "Violent crime spikes 34% in Democrat-led cities. Carjackings triple in Minneapolis. New York homicide rate at 20-year high." He rattled them off like bullet points in an indictment. In Philadelphia, children are getting shot walking to school. In Portland, gangs rule the streets. In Chicago, it's a bloodbath every weekend. He paused, allowing the words to settle like ash in a burning room. "And what's the answer from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party?" he asked, turning his gaze to Jasmine now, with something between accusation and amusement. "Defund the police." His voice twisted the phrase, laced it with scorn. "That's not policy. That's not compassion. That's a roadmap to anarchy." Behind him, the screens began playing B-roll footage. A jewelry store being ransacked, sirens wailing, blurred figures running in the night. "You want fewer officers on the streets?" he asked, voice rising. "Then you'd better be ready for more body bags in the morgue." He slammed his palm lightly on the table for emphasis. Not rage, but performance. The studio lights flared slightly off the silver in his cufflinks. His tone lowered again, wrapping itself in the veneer of patriotic responsibility. "This isn't about race. This is about law. This is about whether a mother in Detroit can walk her daughter to school without being caught in crossfire. whether a shopkeeper in Harlem can keep his doors open without being robbed twice a week. The camera panned to his audience, heads nodding, hands clasping, some whispering affirmations under their breath. Hannity was doing what he did best, feeding fear as proof of wisdom, but beneath his words, crafted to sound like protection, was a chilling implication Jasmine Crockett knew all too well. That safety belonged only to those who could afford it. That police were not guardians, but enforcers of a carefully structured order. And in this studio, she wasn't being asked to offer solutions. She was being put on trial for daring to question the system. Her silence in that moment wasn't hesitation. It was containment. Because while Hannity used crime as currency, Jasmine carried something heavier. Stories. Of boys locked up for stealing diapers. Of girls frisked in front of their schools. Of black men beaten in silence and branded with records that would never let them breathe freely again. And she knew. When the nation equated justice with jails, the most dangerous lie was the one told with perfect pronunciation and a perfect suit. But just as Hannity's final word echoed like a gavel through the studio, more body bags, Jasmine Crockett moved, not abruptly, not with fire, but with the slow, precise gravity of someone who had sat across too many grieving mothers and read too many files stained by state-sanctioned indifference. She didn't raise her voice, but the silence leaned into her, as if the room itself was bracing for what was about to be said. She placed both hands flat on the desk, steady, grounded. Then came the cut, calm but surgical. "This isn't about crime," she said, her tone as sharp as a courtroom verdict. "This is about money, and who becomes a tool for profit in a system built not to serve, but to extract." Her gaze didn't leave Hannity. Her words weren't just spoken. They were directed like arrows. She reached into the folder again, drawing out a printed document with a single, heavy header. Vera Institute of Justice. Pretrial detention report. No graphics, no music. Just paper and the truth. "This," she said, raising it slowly, "isn't an opinion. It's data." Her voice hardened. Over 400,000 people across this country are sitting in jail right now. Not because they've been found guilty, but because they couldn't afford bail. The word couldn't hit with force. "Let me say that again," she continued, pressing the sheet forward so even the camera could catch the bolded text. "Nearly 80% of all people held in local jails have not been convicted of a crime." Her hand trembled just slightly, not from nerves but restraint. "They're there because they're poor, not dangerous, not violent, just poor." She let that land. The audience didn't cheer. They couldn't. It was too ugly to applaud. Jasmine took a breath, but it wasn't relief. It was reload. "So when you talk about law and order," she said slowly, "what you really mean is punishment for the poor." Her voice thickened, but never wavered. "Because here's the truth, Mr. Hannity. If someone can pay $10,000 in bail for a DUI, they're home before sunset. If someone else can't find $500 for a petty theft they didn't even plead guilty to, they rot in a cell for 6 months, or a year, or 3. Her words pulled no punches. They were exact, merciless in their exposure. Justice in America is for sale, and the price tag is not written in law. It's stapled to your income. She lowered the paper back to the desk, but the weight of her message remained in the air like smoke after gunfire. "This system doesn't ask if you're innocent," she said, leaning in now, eyes cold. "It asks if you can pay." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table, white-knuckled. "And if you can't, well, then you are guilty until proven rich." The sentence dropped like steel. No music played behind her. No applause cue, just stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when a wound gets named out loud. And if Hannity thought the room had absorbed enough, if he believed the storm had passed, he underestimated the weight of what Jasmine Crockett still carried. With a single press of a button, the back wall of the studio transformed, not into chaos, but into something far more damning, a clean, color-coded graph. No dramatic music, no manipulated clips. Just a silent curve rising steeply from left to right, glowing blood red under the cool studio lights. Jasmine didn't look at Hannity. She looked directly into the camera, into the eyes of every American watching. "This," she said, her voice sharp as frostbite, is the price of mass incarceration in dollars. And it's going up, not because we're getting safer, but because somebody's getting rich. The chart behind her read Private Prison Revenue 2000 to 2020. Beneath the curve were the names of two corporate giants, Core Civic and GEO Group. Beside the line, the numbers climbed year by year until they reached a chilling final figure, over $4.1 billion. 20 years ago, this industry barely scraped together $800 million a year. She continued, pacing slowly before the image like a trial attorney dissecting motive. Today, it makes over $5 billion annually, and not by accident, not by justice, but by caging human beings. Her tone didn't rise, it sank, like stone in water. This isn't a response to crime. It's an economy of captivity, a machine that eats the poor, chews up people of color, and spits out stock returns. She clicked again. A new visual appeared, a portfolio overview from GEO's investor report, with key phrases in bold: bed occupancy targets, cost per inmate margins, forecasted expansion. The studio froze. Even the camera hesitated, as if unsure whether to keep recording something so grotesquely real. "You want to know what justice looks like in America?" Jasmine said, raising her hand toward the highlighted phrase inmate quota thresholds. "It's a spreadsheet. It's profit per prisoner. It's a system where filling jail cells is more important than emptying them." She turned slowly now, her eyes scanning the crowd. "This isn't criminal justice. It's criminal enterprise." Then finally she drove the nail into the coffin. "They call it prison for profit. But let's name it clearly. This is racial capitalism wearing a badge." She pointed at a third chart. Demographics of inmates in private facilities. Black and brown faces comprising over 67% of the population, though they represent less than 40% of the nation. "They don't arrest for justice. They arrest for inventory," she said. "Because in this system, a black teenage boy isn't a citizen. He's a commodity, a line item, a dollar sign with a heartbeat." Her voice throbbed with conviction now, not outrage, but revelation. "The more they arrest, the more beds they fill. The more beds they fill, the more Wall Street smiles. And in that smile, entire families are broken." Her hand returned to her folder, but she didn't lower her eyes. "So the next time someone asks you why our prison population dwarfs every other developed nation, don't say crime. Say dividends. Say contracts. Say capitalism dressed as justice." The studio remained still, unnerved not by theatrics, but by how little of this had ever been said on a stage so large. Behind Jasmine, the graph didn't just climb, it loomed, like a verdict rendered by silence. But just as Jasmine's final graph burned itself into the minds of every viewer like a financial autopsy of human suffering, Sean Hannity shifted gears, abandoning numbers, abandoning documents, and reaching instead for something older, something insidious dressed in faux common sense. He leaned back in his chair as if he had been waiting for this moment all along, lacing his fingers together and tilting his chin upward like a judge ready to render a verdict. His voice was smooth, performative, worn like a familiar suit. "Congresswoman," he began, lacing her title with a patronizing warmth, "you're talking about profits and prisons, charts and contracts like they sprang out of nowhere. But the real issue, the issue none of you on the left ever want to face, is culture." He motioned toward the camera as though inviting the country to nod along. "We can talk about Wall Street all day long, but let's not pretend that's what's causing gunshots in the streets of Chicago. Let's not pretend that's why 14-year-olds are joining gangs, or why entire neighborhoods are ruled by violence." Then he paused as if building toward the punchline he knew would land. "It's broken homes. It's fatherless households. It's a generation raised on gangsta rap, glorifying drug dealers, drive-bys, and disrespecting police." His tone dipped into a rhythm he had rehearsed for years. "The prisons didn't create the violence, Congresswoman. The music did. The culture did." He nodded, satisfied with the weight of his own conclusion, while in the audience, scattered heads bobbed with the ease of those who had never questioned that narrative. It was a familiar attack, old as Reconstruction, subtle as a lash behind a sermon. He didn't mention race. He didn't need to. The imagery did it for him, absent black fathers, inner city violence, aggressive youth, beats and rhymes and blame. It was a tactic designed not to argue, but to divert, to shift the fault line from the system to the victim, from policy to pathology, from power to poverty. He folded his hands again and offered a final line like the last brick in a moral wall. At some point, maybe the real conversation isn't about police budgets, but about personal responsibility. He smiled as if what he'd said was reasonable, as if it was neutral. But Jasmine Crockett didn't smile. She didn't even blink. Her stillness wasn't silence. It was strategy. A silence thick as storm clouds before lightning tears the sky. She sat for 1 second more than was comfortable. Then she leaned forward, slowly, like someone lowering the barrel of truth onto the table. Her voice, when it came, was low and even, deadly calm. "You just turned the grief of entire communities into a punchline," she said, eyes locked on him like crosshairs. "You just traced centuries of systemic violence, economic starvation, red line maps, and state-sanctioned exclusion, and flattened it into a stereotype about music." She raised her hand, index finger trembling not from fear, but fury held back like floodwater behind a dam. "Do not sit there in a $1 million studio funded by ad dollars and pretend you understand what happens in neighborhoods your producers wouldn't dare step foot in without a camera crew." The camera zoomed slightly, unconsciously drawn to her face. Her jaw was clenched, her breath sharp and measured. "Let me explain something to you, Mr. Hannity," she continued, her voice sharpening. "Rap didn't invent violence. Gangs didn't invent fatherless homes. But this country, the system, invented poverty so deep it ate fathers alive through mass incarceration. It invented schools without textbooks and neighborhoods without clinics. It invented a world where children pick up microphones because the courtrooms and classrooms were never built for them." She paused long enough for her words to settle like steel. "And now you want to blame the soundtrack for the fire you lit?" The silence that followed was unbearable. Not because it was empty, but because it was true. And if the studio had still clung to any illusion of detachment, of politics as sport, of this debate as just another episode, Jasmine Crockett was about to end it. Not with more numbers, not with another chart, but with something far more dangerous: memory. She didn't speak right away. She reached forward with a deliberate calm, her fingertips brushing the worn edge of a separate manila folder. The camera caught the motion. Slow, reverent, heavy. "You want to talk about responsibility," she said, not looking at Hannity now, but down into a story the country had buried under years of indifference. "Then let's take responsibility for what we've done to children we never saw, or worse, refused to see." She opened the folder and pulled out a photograph, the kind that looks ordinary until you know the story behind the eyes. "This is Khalif Browder," she said. The photo hit the screen behind her. No music, no fade-in. Just a teenage boy in a plain white t-shirt, unsmiling. He was 15 when the NYPD accused him of stealing a backpack. He said he didn't do it. There was no physical evidence, no trial, no conviction. But because his family couldn't afford $500 in bail, he was sent to Rikers Island. Her voice dropped lower now, not softer but more focused, like a scalpel. He spent 3 years there, 2 of those in solitary confinement, locked in a cell the size of a parking meter box for 23 hours a day, for a backpack, for $500. The audience was silent now, not stunned, not confused, but gut-punched. Jasmine's hand didn't tremble as she reached again into the folder and withdrew a single page. Creased, aged, photocopied. "This is the letter he left behind," she said, "written 2 years after he was finally released, after the state let him go, but never let him heal." She unfolded it with unbearable care. The audience leaned in. The studio lights seemed dimmer. Even Hannity sat motionless, his gaze lowered. Jasmine's voice was steady as she read. "I'm sorry. I feel like I'm still locked up. I hear the keys every night. I can't breathe outside. I wake up expecting the guards. I don't want to be here anymore." She didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. The words were sharp enough to pierce bone. When she finished, she folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it before her like a relic. Then she raised her eyes, not to Hannity, not to the audience, but to the camera, to the nation. He was never found guilty of anything, she said, each word like a hammer. But this system treated him like a monster because he was black, because he was poor, because he couldn't post bail. She sat back slowly, her voice never rising, but the ground beneath her words shook with something deeper than rage. Khalif didn't die because of violence in his neighborhood. He died because the state put a boy in a cage, left him there, and called it justice. And then she said the line that turned the studio to ice. You tell me what part of that was about culture, and what part was just cruelty, legalized and monetized. And as the weight of Khalif Browder's letter lingered in the room like a ghost no one could exorcise, Jasmine didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't offer the comfort of a pause. She reached forward once more, not to mourn, but to indict. With one firm click of the remote, the screen behind her shifted again, and this time, it wasn't a victim's face or a graph of racial disparity. No, this was colder, more dangerous. What appeared now were corporate logos, GEO Group and Core Civic, glowing like neon brands seared into the steel bars of American justice. Below them, lines of fine print began to scroll down the screen. Campaign donations, lobbying expenditures, bundled funds. A river of money flowing not into rehabilitation programs or school grants, but into election war chests. Jasmine turned toward the camera, her voice no longer wounded, but sharpened to a blade. You want to know why nothing changes? She asked, eyes unblinking. Why we keep locking up black boys for skipping school? Why minor parole violations send thousands back to prison every year? Look here. She pointed to the dollar figures lighting up the screen. $200,000 to a Senate super PAC in 2020, $340,000 in direct contributions to gubernatorial campaigns across 5 states, and millions more spent lobbying for legislation designed not to reduce crime, but to guarantee occupancy rates. The words landed like a gavel, but there was no court in sight, only a stage where power hid behind clean fonts and corporate silence. She clicked again, revealing a slide from GEO Group's own investor report. It read in bold, projected earnings tied to federal inmate populations. Underneath, another line. Occupancy thresholds must remain above 90% to maintain profitability. Jasmine's voice dropped to a whisper, but somehow it cut deeper. They don't just build cages, they plan for them, forecast them, like a crop yield. Her hand trembled slightly now, not with fear but restraint. They don't fear crime, they fear empty beds. Then she turned her gaze directly to Hannity, expression unreadable, gaze flat as stone. This isn't politics anymore, she said. This is policy engineered by profit. And behind every tough-on-crime bill, behind every media segment that calls for more arrests, more punishment, more boots on the ground, there's a check, there's a donor, there's a lobbyist handing your elected officials a script. Her voice rose only slightly, steady like a rising tide. Because politicians don't need to pass justice anymore. They just need to pass profit targets. And then came the line, soft, devastating, final. Politics doesn't put people in cages, but the money behind it does. And that money has a name. She turned her palm up, gesturing behind her to the names still on the screen, Core Civic and GEO Group, as if they were defendants in a courtroom where the jury was watching live from every screen in America. And as Jasmine's indictment of corporate influence still echoed in the silence, Sean Hannity shifted in his seat like a man retreating to his last stronghold, ideology. His voice cut through the moment, sharp, defensive, desperate to regain the narrative. You're not just criticizing flaws, he snapped, jabbing a finger toward her. You're inciting a movement that seeks to erase the institutions that keep this country from descending into chaos. The words came fast now, a torrent wrapped in righteous fury. You call it justice, but what you're really doing is undermining law enforcement, undermining the rule of law. Let's not pretend. Your side chants defund the police and paints officers as villains. You don't want reform, Congresswoman. You want collapse. You want to burn it down and start over. His tone darkened. That's not brave. That's dangerous. The accusation hung in the air like a gavel slammed in haste, loud, clean, and intended to silence. Hannity's eyes flared with the certainty of someone who believed order was synonymous with obedience. But Jasmine didn't recoil. She didn't blink or smile or fold into the defensive crouch the moment invited. Instead, she sat back for a breath, a long, deliberate breath, and then leaned forward, anchoring her hands on the table like someone preparing to deliver a closing argument, not just to a studio, but to a nation. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped, low, precise, stripped of pretense. "No," she said, "I don't want to erase the law. I want to erase the illusion that it belongs to all of us, when it only truly protects some of us." She held his gaze as her words landed, steady and deliberate. "You mistake criticism for destruction, because you've never had to survive the system you're defending. You've never been pulled over for fitting a description, or had to bury a son who couldn't afford a lawyer, or sat in a courtroom where justice is a luxury, not a right." Her tone sharpened, but her volume stayed calm, a storm gathering behind composure. "What I want is not the end of order. I want the beginning of fairness." She glanced at the camera, her next words not a soundbite but a summons. "I want a system where the color of your skin and the balance of your bank account don't decide whether you get a warning or a weapon pulled on you." Then she turned back to Hannity, eyes unflinching. "You say I want to burn it down. I say I want to build it. For the first time. For everyone." Her voice trembled, not from doubt, but from the weight of every name she carried. Names not televised, not charted, but buried. "I don't want fewer laws. I want laws that protect, not persecute, that uplift, not extract, that heal, not brand." She leaned forward now, her final sentence slow and lethal. "Because a law that cannot protect the poor, the black, the voiceless, is not law. It's theater, and the curtain's been pulled back." And as the final syllable of Jasmine's quiet rebuke echoed like a slow tremor through the room, she didn't retreat. She advanced. With one hand, she reached back into her folder, this time pulling out a stack of annotated pages clipped with red tabs, pages worn at the corners, as if they had been opened and closed in rage 100 times. "We've talked about money," she said, her voice low and resonant, "and we've talked about politics. But now let's talk about the raw machinery of injustice, the numbers that don't lie, even when people do." She held up the first page, ACLU and NAACP logos in the corner, line graphs arcing like scars across the top. Then she clicked the remote. The screen behind her lit up with a simple visual, 2 vertical bars, one pale gray, one deep red. "This," she said, pointing to the shorter gray bar, "is the black population of the United States. 13%. She paused, not to emphasize, but to let the scale of that figure settle in the minds of those who had never really seen it. Then she moved to the red bar, nearly 3 times as tall. "And that," she said, "is the percentage of the American prison population that is black. 40%. The contrast was blinding. She turned slowly back toward the room, scanning it. "That's not a coincidence. That's not a blip. That's a pattern, a design, a message embedded into policy, into courts, into patrol routes and plea bargains and bail algorithms." Her tone darkened, not with volume, but with gravity. "This system doesn't just punish Black Americans more harshly. It expects them. It plans for them. It budgets for their incarceration before they even turn 10. She clicked again. A new slide appeared. This one's starker. A table, 2 columns, same charges, different outcomes. According to peer-reviewed studies from the Sentencing Project, for the same nonviolent offense, a Black defendant is 5 times more likely to receive a prison sentence than a white defendant. She didn't need to explain it further. The math was the evidence. The disparity was the crime. And in some jurisdictions, she added, judges have been shown to give longer sentences based solely on name and skin tone. That's not a flaw in the system. That is the system functioning as it was built. Her hand curled slightly over the edge of the table now, knuckles white from the pressure she refused to release. She took a breath, not to compose, but to sharpen. What we have is not a justice system. What we have is a machine of selective vengeance, a mechanism that processes black pain into state data. That converts melanin into mugshots and records and ruins. Her voice dropped to a whisper now, but the words cracked like lightning. This isn't justice. This is legalized racial engineering, a caste system disguised as law, a pattern so complete that even silence becomes complicity. She let her final line fall slowly, precisely into the quiet. This is not equal protection. This is not blind justice. This is apartheid in legalese, codified, spreadsheeted, and quietly ignored, until now. And just as Jasmine's final sentence, apartheid in legalese, settled like ash over the studio, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was electric, heavy, loaded with the kind of tension that turns truth into reckoning. Then, without warning, the control room buzzed in through the earpiece of the floor producer. A soft, clipped voice came through the headset. "We've got a caller. It's someone's mother." The line was already live. The producers hesitated. But something in the voice, fragile, shaking, cut through protocol like a blade. Hannity's team, for once, didn't protest. The screen behind Jasmine flickered. A black square appeared, blank at first, then slowly filled with audio waves pulsing in rhythm with a woman's trembling breath. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the phone line went wide. A voice cracked into existence. "Hello?" The sound came haltingly, not with the polish of a prepared guest, but the rawness of someone who had nothing left to protect. "My name is... I'm sorry," she choked, then continued, her words spilling over each other like grief rushing through a dam. "I didn't plan to speak. I saw you, Congresswoman Crockett, and I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Jasmine didn't speak. She bowed her head gently, listening. The caller steadied herself with a long exhale that trembled through the studio speaker system. "My son's name is Darius," she said. "He's 17. He's been in jail for 6 months now. He didn't hurt anyone. It was a shoplifting charge. His friends dared him to take a pair of headphones from a gas station. $40. That's what it cost. But he couldn't afford bail. $900. I begged the court for a payment plan, anything. But they said no." A hush fell across the studio like the final breath before a plunge. Even Hannity, who moments earlier had thundered about law and order, sat utterly still. His fingers no longer tapped. His eyes didn't wander. He stared down at the table as the voice continued, fragile, but gaining momentum, like a wound being opened on purpose. "He missed his graduation," she said. "He missed Thanksgiving. He missed his little sister's birthday. Every time I visit, he just sits there, shoulders hunched, like he's already disappeared inside himself." Her voice cracked again, this time harder, deeper. "I raised him to believe this country would protect him if he followed the rules. But they never taught me what to say when the rules were sold to someone else." The control room was silent. Not a single crew member moved. The live audience had stopped reacting entirely, frozen between shame and revelation. "I'm a nurse," the woman said. "I work nights. I've never broken the law in my life. But now I have to look my son in the eyes through a glass wall and explain why freedom in this country costs more than we have." Jasmine stood motionless, her hands folded at her waist, her breath shallow. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rescue. She witnessed. And that, more than anything, was what the woman on the other end needed. "Do you know what he said to me last week?" the caller whispered. "He said, 'Mama, I didn't steal the headphones, but I think I'd rather admit it than stay here any longer.'" Gasps rippled through the air, but they were soft, reverent, not the usual outrage of partisan theater. "They broke him," she said, "not with fists, with waiting, with silence, with time," her voice faltered. "I just want him home. I just want him to know he's still worth something, that he's not just a case number or a bed quota or a line on a chart." She paused, then, with every ounce of breath she had left, "Please don't let them tell this story like it's just statistics. It's my baby. It's my child." The line went quiet. A static hum filled the void. She didn't hang up. She didn't need to. Her words had already stayed. Jasmine raised her head slowly. Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't wipe them. She didn't speak yet. The room was frozen in something far more powerful than debate, grief. And in that stillness, Sean Hannity, so often quick with a retort, a counterattack, a change of subject, remained completely, utterly silent. No cards shuffled, no cross-talk whispered through his earpiece. He stared forward like a man watching the floor dissolve beneath him. The story had landed not as commentary, but as a mirror, reflecting a truth so raw, so intimate, that even denial had no place to hide. The audience didn't applaud. It couldn't. It wouldn't. Because applause would have broken the spell. And this wasn't performance. This was revelation. For a moment, the entire nation, through cameras, through cables, through every glowing screen, stood in that same invisible jail cell with Darius, counting the days, wondering how justice became something you could lose access to for $900, wondering how many other mothers were still waiting by a phone, holding their stories in their throats like broken glass. And still, Jasmine said nothing, because in that moment, silence wasn't avoidance, it was respect. Because some truths don't need explanation, only exposure. And as the last tremor of that mother's voice dissolved into the stillness, leaving behind a silence too sacred for applause and too sharp for comfort, Jasmine Crockett took one breath, one slow recalibration of grief into resolve. She didn't look down. She didn't blink. She turned her gaze back to the camera, then reached again for the remote. Her thumb hovered for a moment over the button, and when she pressed it, the studio lights dimmed just enough for the screen behind her to glow like a confession no one could unhear. "Let's stop pretending this is about safety," she said quietly, "and watch how it's actually about sales." A video loaded. The footage was grainy but real, unedited, unrehearsed, and devastating. A corporate conference room appeared on screen, sterile and professional. A man in a dark navy suit, Robert Warden, chief executive of GEO Group, stood at a podium, facing a room filled with investors. The camera caught the glint of crystal water pitchers, the low murmur of anticipation before an earnings report. Jasmine didn't speak. She let the man speak for himself. His voice rang out, calm and proud, projected across the studio speakers. "Our model remains stable because we're confident in occupancy rates. Each inmate is, functionally speaking, a revenue unit. Our focus is not only on securing long-term federal contracts, but also ensuring operational continuity across facilities by maintaining a healthy population baseline." There was a pause in the video, but not in the room. The weight of that sentence, "each inmate is a revenue unit," didn't need emphasis. It echoed louder than any scream. The screen showed no shame, no hesitation, just a spreadsheet behind the CEO, listing terms like capacity utilization, growth forecasts, and average length of stay. Jasmine let it roll 5 seconds longer, long enough to catch the polite laughter from a board member in the front row. Then she clicked to black. For a moment, there was nothing. Just air. Just the uncomfortable rustling of a few studio chairs. Then Jasmine turned, not dramatically, not with flair, but with precision. She looked Hannity dead in the eye, like someone delivering a name at a sentencing. "That," she said, her voice quiet and razor-edged, "is the truth you won't look in the face." She didn't blink. "Not on your show, not in your monologues, not when you wave the flag and pretend this is about protecting America." Her hand hovered just over the stack of files on the table. "You rail against crime, but stay silent when profit requires incarceration. You say you love justice, but look the other way when freedom is priced like a commodity." She began walking slowly, measured steps toward the center of the set, eyes still locked on Hannity. "That man in the video, he doesn't fear crime. He needs it. He counts on it. He budgets for it." She clicked the remote again, showing a still from the GEO investor deck, a bullet point reading, "Risk, decrease in conviction rates." Her voice didn't rise, but the weight behind it deepened like a tectonic shift. "You understand what that means?" she asked, turning toward the audience now. "To these corporations, fewer arrests aren't signs of peace. They're signs of loss." She let that settle. In a just world, justice is measured by how few people we cage. But in their world, justice means maximizing retention. Then she stepped back, slowly returning to her place behind the desk, her hand never leaving the remote. The studio was still gripped in tension, breathless, not from drama, but from exposure. "You called me dangerous," she said, her voice like cooled iron. "You said I want to burn things down." She pointed again to the screen. "But tell me, Mr. Hannity, what's more dangerous than a business model that needs people behind bars to stay afloat? What's more criminal than lobbying Congress for harsher sentencing laws so stockholders don't lose confidence?" Her jaw clenched, but her voice remained steady. "This isn't justice. This is human trafficking in a tailored suit." Hannity said nothing. His eyes flicked once to the camera feed monitor, then back to Jasmine. But there was nowhere to run in that moment. The air had thickened into something immovable, and Jasmine knew it. She leaned forward now, elbows on the table, voice lowering into a quiet that demanded listening. "I'm not here to dismantle order," she said. "I'm here to dismantle the lie that order ever existed in the first place, for people who look like me." She reached once more for the remote and set it down with finality. Because if one man's incarceration funds another man's yacht, then what we have isn't a system. It's a marketplace, and lives like Darius's, like Khalif's, are just product codes. She didn't say another word. She didn't need to. The screen behind her remained dark, but somehow it still spoke louder than Hannity ever could. And after the video faded to black, after Jasmine's words carved corporate cruelty into the bones of the broadcast, she didn't need to yell, didn't need to gloat. She simply lowered her hand, reached for the thick folder that had carried the weight of every statistic, every obituary, every plea for dignity. Slowly, deliberately, she closed it. The sound of the cover snapping shut was soft, barely audible, but somehow thundered in the room like a final judgment. She didn't speak right away. She looked down at the folder for a moment longer, as if acknowledging every name it held, every story that hadn't made the news. When she finally raised her head, her voice had dropped, not with weakness, but with intent, a stillness that demanded reverence. And then it came, low, level, devastating. "If a teenager can be caged just because he doesn't have $500, then tell me, what part of that justice system is worth being proud of?" The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They hung, like the final line of a eulogy, like smoke after a silent explosion. The camera instinctively tightened its frame, drawing closer to Hannity's face. He wasn't blinking. His jaw clenched slightly, barely perceptible. His hands, once so animated with righteous indignation, now sat still, folded, uncertain, no longer performing. For the first time in the segment, there was no counter, no deflection, no talking point plucked from a stack of cue cards off camera. Just silence, a silence thick enough to feel, the kind that follows something irreversibly true. The live audience didn't make a sound. The floor director didn't give any cue. The teleprompter didn't scroll. Time itself seemed to pause, unsure if it should proceed as scheduled or surrender to what had just been laid bare. The screen behind them was blank now, but it may as well have read, "Convicted by truth." Jasmine didn't move. She didn't fill the air with follow-ups or pivot to statistics. She let the question sit like a stone in the center of the room, a $500 stone, a price tag on freedom, a number so absurd in its cruelty that it hollowed out everything Hannity had tried to defend for the last 40 minutes. She leaned slightly back in her chair, not in retreat, but in still, righteous defiance. Her hands folded atop the folder, her breathing slow, deliberate. She wasn't waiting for a response. She knew there wasn't one. There couldn't be. Not one that wouldn't sound like noise against what had just been made visible. Hannity shifted once in his seat, brief, reflexive. A man realizing he was no longer on a fence, no longer controlling the camera or the cadence or the crowd. For years, he had orchestrated this stage, reduced arguments into neat binaries. Strong versus weak, tough versus soft, law versus chaos. But now in this moment, the binary shattered. Because what Jasmine had done wasn't offer a counter-narrative. She had exposed the foundation, and exposed that it was rotting. She tilted her head just slightly toward the audience. Not performative, but intimate. Like someone telling the truth not for applause, but because the silence had gone on too long. "Justice," she said softly, should not be a luxury. She glanced at the cameras, at the nation. It should not be a privilege of the wealthy or a currency for shareholders. It should not bend around skin tone or zip code, and it damn sure shouldn't be a death sentence for being born poor. The words weren't shouted, but they struck like a slow drumbeat inside the chest of every viewer, on phones, on TVs, on laptops flickering in living rooms across America. Still, Hannity said nothing. His mouth parted just slightly, as if the shape of a sentence was trying to form, but nothing came. The camera lingered on him, and for once it didn't feel like spectacle. It felt like accountability. The audience watched, not for drama, but for proof that he had heard her, that the machine could pause, that even the most polished performers had to sit in a truth they couldn't spin. But all they got was silence. He looked away, not far, just enough to signal discomfort. Then back, still no words, and Jasmine, watching him, simply nodded once. A slow, solemn nod. Not of victory, but of recognition. She wasn't surprised. This was always how it went. Speak the truth, the full, undiluted truth, and those who benefit from the lie will retreat into silence, not because they have no voice, but because for once, they have no defense. She looked down again at the folder, still closed, as if to say, there's more in here. I could keep going, but you've already heard enough. Then slowly, she slid it to the center of the table. Here's your law and order, she whispered, not accusingly, but mournfully. A child sits in jail because his mother didn't have $500. And we dare to call that justice? Her hand stayed on the folder for a long moment, fingers curled slightly around the edge. Not for control, but because letting go of it too quickly felt wrong. Felt like betrayal. The lights didn't dim. The show didn't cut to commercial. The audience didn't applaud. And Hannity still said nothing. Because in that moment, the set had stopped being a studio. It had become a courtroom. Not the kind with gavels and robes, but the kind where a nation, watching silently from couches and cubicles and corner stores, had just seen the defendant lose control of his own argument. And the verdict? It was already written. In ink. In silence. In the empty space where a rebuttal should have been, but never came. And as the cameras faded to black and the studio fell into stillness, the impact of what had just unfolded did not stay confined to the soundstage. It moved swiftly, violently, like a rupture in the surface of a country long conditioned to ignore what lay beneath. In living rooms, break rooms, subway cars, courthouse steps, people weren't just watching a clip. They were reliving something. Something buried. Something personal. Something systemically denied. The recording of Jasmine Crockett's confrontation didn't go viral because it was dramatic. It went viral because it was undeniable. Within an hour of the broadcast, the moment where Jasmine looked straight into the camera and asked, if a teenager can be caged just because he doesn't have $500, then what part of that justice system is worth being proud of? That moment was everywhere. It was clipped, looped, translated, and sent across the country like a live wire. Teachers showed it in classrooms. Youth organizers blasted it on megaphones outside city halls. In barbershops, you could hear men grow silent mid-conversation, staring at the screen as that one sentence played again. Not all of them had words, but all of them understood, because they'd seen that boy before. In a cousin, a neighbor, a brother, the kid down the street who disappeared and never came back the same. News anchors scrambled to catch up, but this time, the headlines didn't shape the story. The people did. And the story wasn't just about a failed bail system. It was about what it meant to live in a country where freedom has a price tag and where the inability to pay meant forfeiting your humanity. Local news stations began reporting fresh cases, children locked up for months without trial over bus fare thefts, misplaced wallets, petty shoplifting. The lines between policy and punishment, law and cruelty, blurred in public consciousness like never before. America briefly saw the bars not just around cells, but around neighborhoods, classrooms, futures. But it was one tweet, just one, that turned the echo into a drumbeat. Late that night, as her team monitored the staggering reaction, Jasmine herself sat alone in her office. The overhead light was off, the room lit only by the glow of her screen and the photo of Kalief Browder beside it, framed, unassuming, but present. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Media inquiries, speaking invitations, private texts from members of Congress who'd once ignored her floor speeches, now typing out variations of, "You were right." But she didn't respond to any of them. Not yet. She opened Twitter. She typed without drafting, without checking, without hesitation. Not everyone in jail is guilty, but any system that jails the poor because they're poor is a system that deserves to be on trial. No flourish, no emojis, just the weight of conviction distilled into 140 characters. The tweet didn't just travel, it tethered, not to the usual noise of political discourse, but to the real people who had lived it. Mothers who had mortgaged their homes for bail. Teens who'd come out of holding cells with shadows in their eyes. Public defenders who'd fought uphill in courtrooms built like factories. Within hours, the message had reached every corner of the country, not as a plea for policy, but as a line in the sand, a dare, a mirror, and the country was now staring back at itself. Civil rights groups reposted it with statements of solidarity. Former judges quoted it at town halls. Community leaders painted the words on banners at protests. But the most powerful echoes didn't come from organizations. They came from individuals. From a young man in Georgia who simply wrote, "This tweet is the first time I've seen someone say out loud what happened to me." From a mother in Ohio who shared her son's story and closed with, "Thank you for saying what I couldn't." And yet Jasmine didn't treat the tweet as a victory. She didn't log off and smile. She didn't bask in trending status. She stared at her screen, then back at Kalief's photo. "You should still be here," she whispered. "You should have made it to 25. You should have been free." She closed her laptop slowly and leaned back in her chair, eyes still fixed on the darkened window that reflected the city lights of D.C. Her voice low, steady, only for herself. The system's on trial now, and this time, it doesn't get to walk away. Outside her office, the noise swelled. Journalists gathered. Emails poured in. But inside that room, Jasmine Crockett wasn't preparing for interviews. She was preparing for something deeper, for the reckoning she had just triggered. A reckoning not born in protest chants or party platforms, but in the haunting simplicity of one brutal question. What kind of justice charges children for their innocence? And in one uncompromising truth, if that is the law, then the law itself is guilty. And as the digital noise thundered beyond the walls of her quiet office, retweets, headlines, angry rebuttals, tearful affirmations, Jasmine remained still. The tweet had landed. The country had reacted. But for her, the work was not in the virality. It was in the aftermath, in the reckoning that would follow or fail to, in the hearts that would either change or retreat to comfort. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the weight settle, not just of Kalief's story, but of the thousands like his. The names that wouldn't go viral, the pain that wouldn't be televised. Because behind every statistic she'd read on air, every graph, every policy critique, was a human being who once believed the law would protect them, and learned too late that it was built to profit instead. That was the lesson the cameras never lingered on. Not the spectacle, the soul of the thing. The terrifying truth that injustice isn't always loud. It's efficient. It has paperwork. It has signatures. It has bipartisan support and legal precedent. It wears suits, not hoods. And it doesn't need to shout to break a life. It just needs to ignore it. That's how Kalief Browder was lost. Not because no one knew, but because no one stopped it. Because the gears kept turning and the courtroom didn't pause and the guards didn't ask questions. Because when a system forgets that the people it cages are human, it becomes something else entirely. A business model with a body count. Jasmine had known this, but now America had seen it, and she needed them to remember what it meant. Not just in legislation, but in conscience. In what kind of country they claimed to be. Because the real fight wasn't over bail reform or prison contracts, not entirely. The real fight was moral. It was about what we believe people deserve. Whether freedom is a right or a reward, whether a child with no money is worth less than a child with a lawyer, whether justice is blind or just expensive. The humanity at the core of Jasmine's crusade wasn't rooted in slogans or party lines. It was in the aching universality of the question. What if it were your child? What if it were your brother, your daughter, your name etched onto that intake form in the middle of the night, waiting for a court date that never came? What would you be worth in a world that measures dignity by income? The truth is, the system wasn't broken. It was built with precision. And the most dangerous part wasn't how violently it punished, but how quietly it justified. So the human lesson, was this. Justice without compassion is just arithmetic. Law without empathy is just architecture. And safety that only exists for the privileged isn't safety at all. It's control dressed in clean language. That night, Jasmine scribbled in a notebook beside her desk. Not a speech, not a press release, just a sentence she didn't want to forget. She wrote, "We are not fighting to reform cruelty. We are fighting to replace it with something human." And that, in the end, was the point. That a mother's tears should mean more than a lobbyist's check. That a child's silence in a jail cell should echo louder than a corporate quarterly report. That the worth of a human being should not fluctuate with their bank balance. Because if the law does not recognize the poor as fully human, then the law is not worthy of the society it claims to serve. And if we don't fix that, not just in legislation, but in how we see each other, then we will continue bearing children like Khalif, not because we failed to act, but because we refused to feel. And what Jasmine offered that night, more than any data or quote or devastating line, was this: a reminder that compassion isn't weakness, it's power, that the only justice worth defending is the kind that knows every defendant has a heartbeat, and that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is look at someone our system has discarded and say, "You still matter." Not because it polls well, not because it wins elections, but because it is true. And as the last syllable of Jasmine's midnight tweet echoed through a nation split between conscience and inconvenience, she knew it had touched something raw. But knowledge wasn't enough. Mourning wasn't enough. Even outrage, if not harnessed, was nothing but fire without direction. What had happened in that studio wasn't a performance. It was a summons. And Jasmine wasn't going to let it fade into another viral moment that lived and died inside a headline. If people could feel the injustice that intimately, if they could weep for Khalif, gasp at the $500 bail, rage over the CEO's voice calling human lives revenue units, then they were ready to be called. So the next morning, with sleep-deprived eyes and a still shaking hand, Jasmine walked out of her office and stepped in front of a press gaggle already triple the usual size. But she didn't go to the Capitol. She didn't go to the polished halls of power. She stood on the courthouse steps of a local detention facility in D.C., the exact kind of place where boys like Khalif disappear every single day. The morning air was thick with humidity and tension. Cameramen adjusted lenses. Protesters stood shoulder to shoulder in silence. A mother in the front row clutched a laminated photo of her teenage son. Jasmine didn't wait for the cameras to signal. She gripped the podium with both hands. And when she spoke, it wasn't with applause in mind. It was with urgency that cracked like thunder. "We have spent the last 24 hours grieving," she said, her voice steady but electric. "But I didn't come here to grieve. I came here to interrupt." Her words sliced the morning open like a scalpel. "We've all seen the video. We've all heard the mother on the phone. We've seen the charts, the headlines. But let me be clear, awareness is not action, and justice doesn't grow from sympathy. It grows from pressure." She held up a document, her draft bill to abolish cash bail nationwide. The crowd shifted forward as if gravity itself had changed. "I am calling for the end of wealth-based detention in America," she continued, her voice rising now. "Not tomorrow, not when it's politically convenient. Now." She slapped the paper on the podium. "Because every day we wait, another child is caged not because of guilt, but because their parents couldn't wire transfer dignity in time." She stared into the nearest camera lens, piercing every home watching. "And if that sentence doesn't light a fire under you, then maybe you've never had to choose between rent and a court fee. The reporters jotted notes, but Jasmine wasn't talking to them. She was talking to the ones watching from laundromats, from prison waiting rooms, from classrooms where the textbooks were older than the students. We're told that the law is neutral, that it applies equally. But tell me, where's the equality in a child being held for 300 days while a hedge fund heir walks free the same afternoon? She paused, letting the quiet swell with rage. This isn't justice, this is arithmetic. It's a calculator disguised as a gavel. She looked down at the front row. The mother with the laminated photo met her gaze. Jasmine's voice softened, but the power in it sharpened. To every parent who's been told their child will sit a few nights unless they can find the money, I see you. To every public defender with 80 open cases and a broken copier, I see you. To every kid who pled guilty to something they didn't do just to go home, I see you. She took a breath, not out of fatigue, but to keep herself from cracking. And I will not stop until this system either changes or collapses under the weight of its own cruelty. Then came the call. Not soft, not poetic, but sharp. Director, operational. I'm calling on every state legislator with a conscience to introduce mirror legislation within the next 60 days. No more hiding behind federal gridlock. The time to act is not after the next child dies in a jail cell. The time is now, the crowd murmured. I'm calling on civil rights organizations to shift from awareness campaigns to legal war. I'm calling on district attorneys to audit their pretrial population and release anyone being held solely for lack of funds. And I'm calling on you, the people, not just to post, but to pressure. Your mayor, your judge, your sheriff, name them, tag them, call them out. Her eyes gleam now, not with tears, but with a clarity that only comes when pain becomes purpose. I'm asking students to organize. I'm asking faith leaders to preach. I'm asking artists to make this impossible to forget. And I'm telling billionaires, if you're not funding the solution, then you're complicit in the problem. She held up a second sheet of paper, Khalif's story, not a summary, the original intake report, mugshot, age, bond amount. This, she said, is not a historical artifact. It's a blueprint. There are thousands more just like it. And this time, we don't bury the blueprint. We burn it. And then she looked directly at the mother in the front row, the one still clutching the photo like a rosary. Jasmine stepped down from the podium. She walked to her. She took her hand, held it, and then turned back to the crowd, holding it high, not like a trophy, but like a vow. We fight, she said, because she shouldn't be standing here with a photograph. She should be standing here with her son. The crowd roared, not with celebration, but with resolve. Phones didn't just record, they broadcast. Her speech went live in real time to millions. And in classrooms and break rooms and prison visitor lines, people didn't just watch, they stood. Not because Jasmine had given them permission, but because she had given them language. She had turned mourning into marching orders. That day, bail funds doubled in donations. 10 new chapters of youth abolition groups were formed before sunset. A coalition of public defenders across 5 cities launched a coordinated mass motion for release of all nonviolent detainees under $1,000 bail. And for the first time, corporate donors began pulling out of GEO Group and Core Civic, citing, in their own words, irreparable reputational risk. One CEO tweeted, "If Jasmine Crockett is coming, we're not standing in the way." By midnight, police union reps were on TV. Governors issued panic statements. Senate leadership called her office. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. She just walked back into her office, kicked off her heels, and whispered to herself the same line she'd written in that notebook the night before. "We are not here to fix cruelty. We are here to end it." And this time, it wasn't just a promise. It was a marching order, a reckoning, a revolution, demanded, organized, and owned by the very people the system had spent decades trying to silence. The system had spoken. Now the people were speaking back. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.